Holy shit. That's pretty scary. We that fail. See if this does any better. Certainly feels safer. That Soul Eater gets kind of crazy. Alright, so we finally have the end game update to the Bloodmage physical crit character. This is going to be the complete, as much min-maxing as I could afford to do. And there's quite a lot of changes to the original video. So I'll try to cover all of them. I hope I don't miss anything because there's a bunch. So let's start with the skills, I suppose. So Bone Cage. Now originally it was astral projected and kind of full on-hit damage. One of the changes I've made here is we're going into poison, and what this lets us do is it helps us conserve our mana costs while keeping our clear really good. So basically we cast 1 or 2 times on a pack, they get poisoned. Bursting Plague will add some of that poison damage over time, and then eventually when they die it'll Plague Burst, and when it bursts it'll do physical damage equal to 100% of Plague, and then that'll again get scaled by our physical damage on the tree, and I don't think it can crit, but it does quite a lot of damage. Especially if you have like a bunch of small mobs around a rare, the Plague Burst will explode each of those mobs onto the rare and do a bunch of damage. So that's it's great for clear. It's great for single target in your while you're mapping. To scale our poisons, we have Comorbidity, and we also have Snakebite. So Snakebite gives us some base poison chance, 20% here, and it also gives us targets can be affected by +1 of your poisons at the same time. So with Snakebite, with Comorbidity, we get a total of 3 poisons. There's a couple nodes on the tree you can pick up, which we don't pick up, but you could if you wanted even more poisons. So 3 poisons is a pretty good number. We keep in Inspiration, and we add in Magnified Effect. So we leave in Inspiration just to keep our mana costs low. We don't need Life Tap anymore because, well, I'll be going over the mana changes later. But we leave in Inspiration and Magnified Effect. So I've done some testing, and I'm pretty sure Magnified Effect affects the explosion radius of Plague Burst. So we leave this in just to get bigger explosions and also a little bit better coverage, since we are now casting Bone Cage around our body, which is a little bit more dangerous than astral projecting it onto the enemies. Now, I think you could argue that you can swap out like maybe magnified effect or comorbidity for astral projection and kind of keep the same playstyle you had earlier and still get poisons. That would be fine if that's what you want to do. But this served me well, so I kind of kept it in. It's kind of nice not having to project all around you to get great coverage. So for example, if you're in a breach, you can just kind of teleport around and drop your bone cages and it'll hit everything on the screen, basically. So that's what that one's there for. So Bone Cage is now poison. Bone Storm we've left mostly the same. So we're not really investing into anything poison for Bone Storm. And once I show you the tree, you'll see that we didn't even really pick up anything poison on the tree. But Bone Storm, we've got Splinter, as we had before. Same with Scatter Shot. Considered casting, that may be a new add. But basically, we've got so much cast speed that we've added this in to get kind of a big chunk of damage for Bone Storm. Physical Mastery to get another tiny bit of damage. And Concentrated Effect, which we went over last time, is basically free damage. It doesn't have a mana multiplier. It affects half the skill, but half the skill at 40% is a 20% damage boost, so that's still pretty good. So we leave that in. Eye of Winter is mostly the same. I've added an Unleash, so that lets us not have to cast it quite as much on bosses. So it'll send out 3 orbs now, and it'll stack up that critical weakness that we need so much on bosses. It'll stack that up in one cast, almost guaranteed. So that one's very good. We do still have Detonate Dead. I find that I'm not using it as much now that I have poisons and the Poison Prolif and Poison Explosion. But this is still good in certain scenarios in Breach, I would say. Mostly where you kind of want to capitalize on like the corpses that are around and really kind of destroy some rares. So this is still pretty good. So I'll just go over the skill gems, the supports, in case they've changed. Execute, Spell Echo, Inevitable Critical, Ambush, and Arcade Tempo. Tip Chains. This is our bossing kind of utility spell. I would not say it's critical, but it is extremely helpful on your pinnacle bosses. Like the Breach, you know, the +4 Breach boss. This thing will make it so that they just use their abilities much slower. You can chuck it down. It's got decent AoE with these gems. So we have Expanse here. Curse Ground makes it curse instantly. And Heightened Curse just gives it a little bit more curse effect. And then Ritualistic Curse gives it more AoE. So, ton of AoE on this thing for free, basically. And it gives you a little bit of time to kind of channel your Bone Storms against bosses, which I've found to be enormously helpful against pinnacle bosses. Against every other boss type, you just kind of murder them instantly, so you don't need it. But pinnacle bosses just have too much health. So, cast on crit. This is we'll move this to the bottom. This is kind of like this the very, very end game setup. Once you have everything else in the build figured out, you can kind of add this in. So we'll go over that in a minute. Herald of Plague. So this is how we're getting such great clear on our Bone Cage. So Herald of Plague spreads poisons in a 1.7 meter radius. We did have to use kind of a lower level Herald of Plague to meet the dex requirements. So we have a level 10, and you'll see it has +1 from corruption, +1 from support. So those added levels don't influence the attribute requirements. So that's kind of why we have those in there. So we can keep it lower leveled, but have the +1s there to improve the effect of it. So this is important for, just spreading our poisons, killing units, proliferating our plague bursts across the screen. It really helps out. Blink, same as before, no change. Grim Feast, same as before, no change. This just lets us, overcap our energy shield. So, cast on crit. Once you have a lot of spirit, you can add cast on crit for some single target. So either single target or map clearing. So I think there's two major setups I would recommend. The one I have in now is for single target bossing. We have Arc, Conduction for more shock chance. And the reason I choose these two is because shocking will actually increase our Bone Storm's damage. So I think I've noticed we get around 22% shock. So this setup is 22% more damage. Even if it did 0 damage itself and just gave us shock, it'd be 22% more damage for our Bone Storm. So it does also do damage, which is kind of nice. So we have shock, life tap, and I'll go over this a little bit, but you absolutely need life tap, along with leech from crits. So against bosses, you'll definitely need these two, and I'll explain that interaction in a second. Chain, so Arc scales with the number of chains, and this thing makes it chain, instead of just chaining 5 times, it chains 12 times. So we get 15% more damage for each remaining chain. And I'm pretty sure the less multiplier is not quite as detrimental as the more damage is beneficial. So I think the math on that checks out. If it doesn't, let me know. And then impetus to kind of get more energy. If you only have, 3 or 4 links, I would remove chain probably and get impetus. Or, kind of test it out and see how many procs you're getting on bosses, because generally you won't even notice this on rares or map clear, because you just murder everything so fast. So anyway, cast on crit, I want to go into that a little bit more. So I don't think people realize how good Bone Storm is for cast on crit. I was looking at, some footage of killing bosses with this thing. And what's actually happening is this projectile can crit, this explosion can crit, and each of them can trigger cast on crit. So combine that with the fact that we're firing 20 Bone Storms at max charge, up to 20 projectiles. We actually get 40 procs of our cast on crit. Potentially, assuming each one of these gives us enough energy. And I've kind of noticed that happening. So what happens is you will full charge a Bone Storm, send it off to a boss, and then our cast on crit will trigger 20 to 40 times, somewhere in that range. And it will drain your life, it will drain your mana. The reason we put life tap on here, and we couple that with its series acuity, is to sustain the cost of casting this 40 times in a split second. So you'll see arc cost is 284 life, So if you do the math on that, 284 times 40 is a lot of life. But if we have instant leech, and because we're a blood mage, we are leeching, and we instant leech it back, and we use a particular type of skill that hits instantly and doesn't have like a delay or anything, it will heal itself back up. So it'll pay its mana cost back for us. So that's why we use life tap, and that's why we use instant leech when we have this setup. Now I will say that getting cast on crit set up is quite expensive. You need a lot of spirit. I think at a minimum you probably need what I have here. So 40 spirit on an amulet, 40 spirit on a chest piece, 30 spirit on a helmet, total of 110 spirit. And that kind of lets you fit all this other stuff in that you kind of need. You could argue for dropping out like either Blink or Grim Feast. I probably wouldn't drop out Herald of Plague. You could argue for dropping out some of that stuff if you don't have, you know, all of the spirit on your gear. But again, we're showing the min-maxed of min-maxed versions of this build. So there's still room to go in terms of min-maxing, but this is kind of where I got to within a reasonable time frame. So anyway, that covers skills. I guess let's go over the gear quickly. So we touched on the gloves. Our wand is kind of the same. Let's see, we have crit chance in here, +5 to physical spell skills. So wand is kind of the same. Helmet, we get Etziri's Disdain, which gives us a chunk of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield, and there's a particular interaction we're taking advantage of with Mind Over Matter, not Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery. So Eldritch Battery converts our energy shield into mana. So if this is off, for example, we have no energy shield because it's all getting converted into mana from Eldritch Battery on the tree, which is right here. But once we put this on, you'll see that we do have energy shield. So there's it's either a bug or it's an intended interaction with this particular mod, gain 30% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield. And so that gives us 2,000 energy shield for free, in addition to letting us use Eldritch Battery to sustain our mana costs and get a giant mana pool for other types of scaling, which I'll talk about in a second. So this, I think this is critical for the build. It lets us use Grim Feast to overcap our energy shield, which gives us a ton of effective life, which is very useful in like breaches in particular. I would say during bossing, you don't really get a whole lot of value out of your energy shield unless you have some way to restore it. So a chest piece, which I don't have one, but a chest piece with like faster energy shield, start of energy shield recharge would be very helpful for sustaining your energy shield during bosses. But again, it's a single piece of gear giving us 2,000 energy shield. So we keep that in. Let's see, the other change I made was on our focus. So you'll notice it no longer has +2 to all spell skills, and we instead have a ton of spell damage, spell physical damage, crit chance, and cast speed. And the reasoning for that is basically to reduce the cost of our skills, but keep the damage almost the same. So if you stack a whole bunch of spell damage and spell physical damage, you can kind of get it's not quite as good damage-wise, but it's almost as good as having +2 to all spell skills and like kind of middling spell damage rolls. So we put this in, it reduces our mana cost because our skills are a little bit lower level, and we get basically the same amount of damage. So I would make this swap unless you just happen to find a really crazy, you know, +1 or +2 to all spell skills focus. And we can also get like some resistances on here. But so the other change we made was, so let's talk about boots real quick. So boots, I fixed my resistances with ingenuity and the rings, and then that kind of opened up some options for our boot slot. So on the boots, I ended up getting massive stun threshold and freeze duration, and a little bit of rarity and some mana. So we have freeze duration combined with this jewel on the tree gives us approximately 80-something% reduced freeze duration. So we are effectively, I want to say, effectively immune to freeze. Like, freezes last a split second. You don't barely even notice them. So that combination, I think, is very strong. And it lets us drop all of the freeze threshold on the jewels that I recommended earlier in the earlier video. The stun threshold is just very nice for reducing the number of times we get stunned throughout a map. You can't really fix stun, as far as I'm aware, for this build without some crazy investment, but we couple our flat stun threshold on the boots with this node down here, and I'll talk about how the tree is reworked in a second. But these two nodes are pretty good. The stun recovery is especially good, so this increases the speed at which you recover from stuns, which is kind of a rare stat. You can't really get that on gear. But these two nodes combined together make stuns fairly manageable, and then combine that with a charm, and you're kind of golden on stun. So that's the boots. Now the belt. This is by far the most expensive piece in this min-max version. I would say you don't actually need it. I used it to kind of get better rolls on the rest of my gear. And basically how this works, if you're unaware, is it increases the bonuses you get from your rings by 80%. And so you can kind of invest a lot into your rings to get really, really good bonuses out of your rings. So the primary one we've got going here is a resistance ring with 20% cast speed and 89 life. We've used some, what is this called? Some alternate quality catalysts to give it lightning quality, which increases this roll as well as the elemental resistances roll. So the lightning res roll and the elemental res roll. And so, you know, this ring is giving us a ton of resistances. So right now we're overcapped a little bit on each one. And if I take this off, you'll see lightning goes down to -15. Cold goes down to 12. So this ring coupled with this belt is doing a whole lot of work in this build. Now this ring over here, this one we get cast speed, intelligence, and mana are the primary rolls we're looking for, as well as a little bit of fire res to patch up, you know, this 41% that we were missing. So cast speed, I think, is one of the more important rolls. You'll notice, you know, 80% of 25% is like 20 or something like that. So this is roughly 45% attack speed for the build. It's pretty good. Intelligence is kind of similar, right? So, you know, we're at 200 intelligence without this. We're at 259 with it on. Intelligence adds to our mana, which we're scaling for a little bit of damage and recovery and things like that. So this is a very, very good ring coupled with this belt. So that just about covers gear. Our gloves, we have poison on hits, or we have instant leech. So I would say if you do not have a cast on crit setup, use your poison on hit gloves. This one is fantastic for clear, fantastic for breach specifically. Um, and you don't really need perfect rolls on it. You just, because it comes with 20% poison on hit. Targets can be affected by +1 poisons. And then this one, once you have your cast on crit set up and you have your life tap in there, you need this to not murder yourself, basically, when you're casting Bone Storm. So you kind of drop out some poison effectiveness to hit some, get some leech, instant leech. Now you could also, I've played around with the idea of taking Voracious down here. 20% of leech is instant instead of what we've got now, which is Aspiring Genius. So you could anoint Voracious and potentially drop this out. I haven't tested it myself to see if 20% of leech is sufficient for sustaining the cost of arc, which is 284 life. So I haven't actually tested that one out. I may do that after this video just to see. But for now, Series Acuity is a good good kind of substitute. Gives us a little bit of crit, a little bit of intelligence. Those are stats we want. You can corrupt it to get 2 sockets, and then do what I did, which is give it some all res to patch up your resistances. Or if your resistances are fine, you can give it chaos res to patch up your chaos res. We're currently at 35, or with this one we get around 50, and that's been manageable. It's not amazing. You can also get rings. I have one ring that would cap my chaos res that I use from time to time if I'm on a poison heavy map or extra damage as chaos map. I'll throw that in there. But other than that, that's the gear. We've removed our weapon swap setup entirely. So, no more ball lightning warp action. But we haven't really needed it. Everything just, honestly, things died too fast to even be able to lightning warp. Which is, that's a good problem to have. So, alright, so let's talk about the tree then. So the tree is vastly different. Basically what we do is we kind of go towards each of these jewel sockets to get a bunch of stats out of the jewel sockets. So we removed this whole section. We removed a little bit of stuff over here. We removed like this AoE. So basically, to kind of talk broadly about it, we go up to this center point, we take the jewel socket, jewel socket, jewel socket. We go over here to jewel socket, to another jewel socket, close to some crit. This one passes by some crit, so we go here. We go to this jewel socket, we go to this jewel socket. We go down here to get a little bit of effectiveness for our poisons. The extra poison duration is pretty handy. It's fairly cheap, only 3 points. Those are the only 3 points we spend on poison on the tree. So pretty point efficient to get poison. And then we've added in some stuff here. So we take this physical damage because it has good synergy with crit. We've dropped out this physical node. I talked a little bit about this jewel here, but to go into more detail, you get Against the Darkness can have a bunch of different roles, and the ones I've taken are reduce freeze duration on each of the small passives in the radius, and gain 4% of damage as extra chaos on all the notables. So each of these small passives has reduced freeze duration, which coupled with our boots gives us a ton of freeze immunity. And then each of the passives gives us 4% damage as extra chaos, which counts towards the poison magnitude. which is why we take as chaos. But it's just a little chunk of damage to make up for losing a jewel socket. So I would, you know, play around with it. There may be other combinations that are decent that you can try. That's what we went with there. So this crit is the same. This crit is the same. We added in invocated efficiency for our triggered spell to do. These numbers are so big on the like spell damage. So we add that in once we have cast on crit set up, and then recover 3% mana when you invoke a spell. I don't know if that thing even works. So I've looked at some of the footage from like doing bossing, and when I cast Bone Storm, this should restore my mana basically to full, right? Because we're life tapped on our spell. And so if we're triggering it 40 times, we should get a ton of mana back, and I haven't really noticed it doing anything. So I'm not sure if this is bugged or if there's just, you know, something that I'm not understanding about how it works. But anyway, this is big damage for our cast on crit setup. Over here, so this section here, Eldritch Battery, Arcane Intensity, and then this section here, Adverse Growth, and then this section here, Lucidity. This is our kind of new defensive layer that wasn't in the build before. So we convert our energy shield to mana, which is why we have 2,600 mana down here. That, of course, removes our energy shield. So we need a way to kind of make up for the loss of defenses, which we do through damage taken from mana before life. So there's 3 nodes we take here, giving us 16%. There are 2 nodes here, giving us another 8%. So that's like what, 24-ish, something like that. 24% damage taken from our mana before life, and then some recoup when we take damage, and then that helps us make up for the defensive stats we lose by converting our energy shield. It also helps in bosses, since we don't have a good way to restore energy shield versus bosses. So versus bosses, this helps us maintain a good health pool that can be restored. So we're getting a ton of mana regen, right? We've got 156, which is actually not that crazy. But combined with the recoup, we're actually getting a lot of mana back, and if this thing worked properly, we would get the mana back there as well. But basically, our mana is easier to restore than our energy shield is, and that basically lets us take advantage of another defensive layer against bosses. And then we add this in, which gives us a chunk of damage. So 3% per 100, so that's 30% per 1,000. So this is what, 60%, 70, 80? 80% damage from these 3 nodes. So this is just a chunk of damage now that we have mana, now that we have a large mana pool. And that also lets us get other affixes on our gear to help scale our damage, so we can get, you know, mana on rings, int on other pieces of gear, etc., to help scale our damage with this node. I think you could arguably not take this stuff. You could leave this Eldritch Battery out and then figure out a way to restore your energy shield versus bosses in a more consistent manner. I'm sure there's some options here, but this just looked like, you know, something. This just looked pretty good, so we took it. It worked out pretty well, and then I did some, you know, testing versus some of the Pinnacle bosses, and it really does make us a lot tankier. So, in my opinion, I guess. So anyway, that's one of the other major changes in the tree. Now for our jewels, we did change a little bit about how how we're selecting mods. So because we're slightly poison, we're adding in magnitude of damaging ailments you inflict with crits and magnitude of ailments you inflict. So these are pretty big. I would suggest getting at least like 40% or 50% magnitude across each of your gems. Across, not each of your gems, across all of your gems total. And that kind of will let your poison damage do a lot more. So this is a separate multiplier for your poison damage in addition to like increases and stuff. So we have a little bit of that, as well as, you know, just the standard like crit damage for spells, spell damage, etc. You can throw in energy shields still. You can throw in I like debuffs expire on you faster. I suspect that works for stuns. So it's like, you know, a stun recovery modifier, as well as like a, you know, just a general nice to have. So I threw that on a couple of these gems. Energy shield, crit damage, chance to inflict ailments. So you might need a couple of chance to inflict ailments. But I wouldn't say that it's strictly necessary. But you get a lot of value out of your jewel sockets, which is why we pick up so many of them. And then let's see if there's anything special here to talk about. The other interesting jewel, I would say, is this one here, Prism of Belief. So these are quite expensive. This may be the second most expensive piece of the gear. I think I spent 20 divines or something just for this jewel. But it is a massive amount of damage. So +3 to level of all Bone Storm skills. So if we look at our Bone Storm, you know, we're at 75k DPS. And then without this, looks like it doesn't update properly. We're at 50k. So 50% more damage from a single jewel socket is a little absurd. Like, pretty absurd. So it's definitely something you can add in once you have the resources to do so. But besides that, the tree is mostly the same. We still take the recoup. Keep all the recoup. See, we drop out, because we drop out a lot of crit, we pick up some crit over here, crit damage bonus. I did play around with this pathing here, but it just costs too many points. But this is a pretty good cluster if you can fit that in. You have some crit here that I wasn't able to squeeze in. You could take a look at these poison nodes as well and see if, you know, extra poison or poison duration. I found them to be just a few too many points to think about putting them in. And then I had this in for a while, First Approach, which is kind of nice for just map clear. 80% damage and 50% crit chance when they're on full life. So basically, you know, every time you see a new pack, they're going to be on full life, and your bone cage will hit like a truck, and then the poison prolif will do the rest of the work. So I think you could argue for taking this cluster, the First Approach cluster, and then Low Tolerance cluster combined with the First Approach cluster is kind of like just the cherry on top. So effect of poison, 60% increased effect of poison is like a more multiplier for your poison. But it does only affect the first poison, so it's not like crazy good. but it is pretty good for like ensuring the first thing you touch dies and proliferates as quickly as possible.